Good morning, everyone. It's Saturday morning. I'm not sure if anybody will watch a live stream at 8 o'clock on Saturday morning. Of course, it's 8 o'clock in Brisbane, and for those people with daylight saving, a little bit after 9. So hopefully you can join me, and hopefully you can share this video and invite a few other people to join in as well. Look, I've just written a fairly long article, and thought I'd like to share it with you in a live video. And it's pretty interesting little rant had by a radical Marxist leftist person in Australia and in Melbourne. So let's have a look at that now, and we'll crack straight into it. My article's called "Don't Complain About Tyranny Until You're Oppressed," like Ethiopia or Sudan. And here we go with a picture of the statue of Lenin being pulled down from Ethiopia after they'd finished their disastrous experiment with Marxism. Got rid of a monarchy and destroyed the country. Identity politics is intellectual bludgeoning. I did a quick search to make sure I was using that correctly, and yep, I am. To bludge is to shirk responsibility and live off the efforts of others. But before I point the finger at the usual perpetrators of identity politics, leftists, let me acknowledge those right of centre are too often guilty of it too. We think Christian politicians will bring conservative values to their policies and politics, which is just lazy. It's as nonsensical as saying all new immigrants should vote Labor, which Labor certainly expects. But both Kevin Rudd and Scott Morrison profess to be Christians, and they have very different policies on very important social and economic issues. Yet many undecided voters were persuaded to support both of them because of what they believed and did Sunday morning instead of Monday to Friday. That's just lazy and dumb. It's intellectual bludgeoning because you're refusing to put any effort into supporting your conclusions with research, investigation, or inquiry, preferring instead to just recline on the couch of assumptions, letting stereotypes and generalizations carefully crafted by people you've never met do all the work for you. Identity politics, though, is more often observably the playground of radical leftist thinking and the weapon of radical leftist leaders like Karl Marx, who sought to divide people based on their economic identity. Cultural Marxism was the mid-20th century evolution of his failed ideas into the division of people based on other identity traits. In prosperous America, where the workers were very happy and comfortable, it was too hard to create resentment and bitterness to people who were different. In Ethiopia, however, Marx's economic revolution found fertile soil amidst drought and famine in 1975. A military junta called the Derg overthrew and abolished the Ethiopian monarchy and adopted Marxist-Leninism as their official worldview. They went on a bloody campaign of terror to quell political opposition and consolidate control of the suffering nation. The Derg were full-on socialists, redistributing land to the workers in the name of fairness and social justice. As with all unbridled socialist systems, Ethiopia was catastrophically plunged further into famine due to corruption, constantly violent government, and mismanagement by people who'd risked nothing to acquire control, which resulted in huge reductions in farming productivity and efficiency. Ethiopians finally revolted against the Marxists and ended socialist rule, instead embracing a federal democracy in the mid-1990s. There's a lot to be said for freedom, the opposite of socialism. It's not just a selfish fantasy by hard-right hyper-individualists, but a historically proven system, more conducive to human flourishing and more resistant to tyranny and corruption than any other system. It turns out, however much freedom you're prepared to lose is how much oppression you're prepared to welcome. Speaking of the intellectual bludgeoning, which is identity politics, I read an article this week in the Sydney Morning Herald by a 30-something lawyer and human rights advocate who, according to her Wikipedia page, was born in a refugee camp in Ethiopia of a family fleeing the Second Sudanese Civil War. Now, this lady, Nyadol Nuon, knows real oppression. One of the many Ethiopian conflicts under the dying Marxist regime forced her family to leave the place they were meant to be finding refuge and walk for 40 days back to southern Sudan when she was just 4 years old. She spent her teenage years living in a mud house. At the age of 18, out of the countless millions of people living in Africa and millions more around the world desperate for a safe and rich Western democratic nation to call home, Nuon was privileged to be accepted as a migrant to Australia with her family. She achieved a scholarship with the help of a professor and was given $10,000 by a woman she inspired with her story. Nuon worked hard and achieved Juris Doctor at the Melbourne Law School. She regularly criticises Australians and Australia for its incidents of racism targeting her friends, and people who look like her. Her attacks are against people like Peter Dutton when he expressed concern about gang violence in Melbourne with common ethnic affiliations. She also receives a lot of criticism and ugly abuse for her efforts. It's more than fair to say Australia is one of the most popular choices of refugees fleeing ethnic violence, genocide, and religious oppression. It's also noble and good to resist any incremental increases in racial hatred and abuse. Less so, though, if your rhetoric is discredited by gross generalizations, hyperbole, and exaggeration. Yet, Nyadol Nuon wrote an opinion in the Sydney Morning Herald in which she presumed to lecture anti-authoritarian Australians about the privilege underlying their concerns regarding vaccine mandates. She wrote, quote, "These groups want us to believe they are now so oppressed that their condition warrants description as segregation, even apartheid. My instinctive response is that they are far closer to privilege than oppression." How quaint. Perhaps I might suggest Nuon reflect on the applicability of her words to her own privileged activism. Perhaps my instinctive response to her assertions that she is now so oppressed that her experience of Australia warrants description as racist and misogynist is that she, a Sudanese refugee prospering in the generous embrace of Australia, she is far closer to privilege than oppression. That's not my response. It's hers, and it's intellectual bludgeoning. My response to her account of abuse and fear is concern and listening. Nyadol Nuon has every right and reason to speak against the oppression she doesn't want to experience in even small amounts. It's immense in her experience, though infinitesimal in contrast to the nations, politics, and cultures her family fled. It's ironic. She should presume to condemn Australians concerned about the presumption of a government that it can mandate medicine against a person's will, in the most egregious display of centralized authoritarianism this nation has ever seen. The oppression goes far beyond what she deigns to acknowledge an injection some people are desperate for, but extends to the indefinite deprivation of privileges such as working, worshipping, traveling, shopping, socializing, and education. It is, and quoting her now, she says, "It is truly privileged upon privilege to not only live in a country that has more than sufficient supply of vaccines while others have no access, but also to choose not to get vaccinated. Perhaps some people have genuine fears about the impact of getting the vaccine. In that case, one can speak to a qualified health professional. However, most of the arguments advanced by anti-vaxxers are, to put it mildly, ridiculous. Perhaps that is one reason they attempt to legitimize their claims of oppression by misappropriating terms like segregation and apartheid." End quote. So, when exactly should the citizens of a liberal democracy begin to recognize the incremental advances of authoritarian socialism? Should it be when we're placed under curfew, our children are banned from schools, families are banned from churches, parents are banned from going to work, family businesses are financially ruined, and everyone is told they don't deserve freedom if they don't inject what the government tells them to? Should we wait until police are firing rubber bullets into crowds of peaceful protesters and assaulting old ladies they've already knocked to the ground? Should we wait to resist oppression until Australian society is plunged into a civil war or devastated by Marxism like Ethiopia? I mean, we're not really oppressed until we're oppressed like an African developing nation, suffering under political oppression, political corruption, incompetence, and authoritarianism, are we? It's not just ironic, but sheer hypocrisy when someone who resents and vocally bemoans the derogatory and demeaning language of racist insults then indulges liberally in the intended epithet anti-vaxxer. That deliberate language is intended to marginalize and demean people with sincere concerns and convictions who resist government attempts at coercion, even if they've dutifully followed government vaccination schedules before the invention of mRNA. Nyadol Nguyen must rely upon double standards and personal attacks to reinforce her opinion because her intellectual arguments are not fit for purpose. She claims, "In the case of anti-vaxxers, the issue seems to me straightforward. Consequence follows decision. This seems lost in the narrative of oppression adopted by those opposed to vaccines. They appear to be demanding a high degree of autonomy and freedom unmitigated by the consequences of personal accountability. It is an artificial definition of freedom and autonomy that is as persuasive as the reasons for a toddler tantrum." End quote. If a narrative of oppression can cloud a straightforward issue, Nguyen has mastered the weaving. Her narrative of oppression is repudiated by a wonderful Melbourne University education, subsequent career in commercial litigation, an occasional taxpayer-funded platform for her opinions on the ABC, liberty to publicly criticize powerful government ministers, frequent inclusion in national newspapers, and keynote speeches around the nation. Either a narrative of oppression should be sought to be understood, or it should be ignored. It's fair to assume the lawyer wouldn't want her narrative thrown out of court, so the narrative submitted by her adversaries must also be ruled admissible. Quote, "Those opposed to vaccines," end quote, is just deceitful. As detailed above, the vast majority of people described by bigots as anti-vaxxers are not in the least bit opposed to all vaccines, as this lazy or malicious choice of words implies. They are opposed to mandates or therapies with no long-term safety data, or the TGA's censoring of scientific debate by healthcare professionals, or the unethical and ongoing use of aborted fetal cell lines in research, development, testing, and/or production, or the state-sanctioned discrimination against equal citizens. It's a signal you've forfeited the high ground when you misrepresent the arguments you're attempting to refute, as Nguyen does. I'm happy to stipulate to her claim conservatives, quote, "demand a high degree of autonomy and freedom," end quote. Of course. And what's more, so what? Of course some, not anywhere near enough, Australians demand a high degree of autonomy and freedom. What's remarkable is most don't, and would rather we inch or stride closer to an Ethiopian-style Marxist wasteland of political and social devastation. The more centralization, socialism, and authoritarianism a nation imbibes, the more its citizens suffer, starting with the most vulnerable. It's pig ignorant to not want complete freedom from the chains of tyranny for your family, for your friends, neighbors, and nation. Quote, "unmitigated by the consequences of personal accountability," end quote. Consequences are one thing, but the punitively imposed burdens upon God-given freedom by a government treating innocent people like children and criminals is an entirely unrelated thing. The very literal segregation of clean and unclean citizens who are in perfect health is not a natural consequence. It is a political policy, a choice made by self-righteous technocrats imposing their vision of the world in defiance of all notions like justice, equality, informed consent, privacy, and liberty. Apartheid is an accurate word because it literally means a politically imposed apartness, keeping equal people apart. Quote, personal accountability, end quote, is all every freedom lover wants. You be accountable for the decisions you make, and I'll be accountable for mine. No one should escape accountability for the human rights abuses of authoritarian governments, resulting in mental health pandemics of suicidal behavior, eating disorders, and self-harming in our hospitals. But the Marxist definition of personal accountability actually means indentured servitude and slavery to the collective, unquestioning obedience to the Central Committee, and informing on your non-compliant comrades to the Stasi. By accountability, they mean an ever-increasing invasion of ever-expanding government into your home, your family, your business, your privacy, your wallet, and your physical body. Accountability. So yes, again, of course freedom lovers demand freedom unmitigated by any authoritarianism, to speak much more plainly than Marxists do. This is not an artificial definition of freedom and autonomy. It is cultural Marxists and authoritarians who occupy themselves for decades objecting to definitions of words like marriage and confecting artificial definitions of words like patriarchy, privilege, racist, homophobe, misogyny, equality, and on ad nauseum. Nyadol Nyuon makes the dishonest mistake made by so many Marxists and authoritarians that everyone doing what they want them to do is the only true application of principles of social responsibility. Doing what the status quo enabled government wants is how she proposes we practically implement freedom. I'm serious. Quote, it is impractical to implement a notion of freedom without responsibility because we live in a society, end quote. Like every useful propagandist, she wraps this nonsense in a euphemistic bow and calls it responsibility, completely absolving every member of society of any personal responsibility while imposing responsibility on everybody for everybody else's lack of responsibility is how communist regimes routinely end up starving millions of their own people to death. It's stupidity gone to seed. This self-confused lady asserts, quote, it is unlikely that one is oppressed when the circumstances of their complaint is one they brought into existence by choice and which they can end at any time by choice, end quote. Now, this is very useful advice for someone living in a racist, misogynist Australia by choice. They're not really oppressed. Their suffering too can end at any time by choice. We should definitely let every Chinese journalist imprisoned by that authoritarian regime know that Nyadol Nyuon said the circumstance they find themselves in is one brought into existence by choice, and they should just make better career choices. In fact, Nyuon's sentiments and arguments resonate with the Chinese communist notion of the harmonious society, an excuse for suppression of dissent and criticism of the regime. Likewise, the word Islam is often thought to mean peace, while it actually means submission. But it's the same thing to an authoritarian, a Marxist, or a tyrant of any other colour. You see, the more authoritarians gush about how much they care about everyone by forcing everyone to do what they want, the more everyone suffers from the bottom of society up. Elites like this privileged, university-indoctrinated, nationally platformed lawyer will always be the last to feel the real suffering of the people they despise, the people who disagree with them, the people beneath them. Instead of hearing the concerns of Australians about pernicious policies in an Australian context, Nguyen ignores concerns about government abuse of power because we're Australian, because we're not oppressed enough, not oppressed like African nations with both tyranny and poverty. Dismissing arguments because of identity, Nyadol Nguyen concludes her parade of willful ignorance by saying, quote, "If those who are against vaccines want to be believed as freedom fighters of an oppressive regime equal to apartheid, then they have misjudged the costs of freedom fighting if their complaints are not being able to visit their favorite hair salon or cafe." End quote. This is the most appalling and most common behavior of authoritarianism's apologists. This is intellectual bludgeoning perfected to a fine art. This is sometimes called a straw man argument, with a tinge of character assassination and a generous pinch of emotional manipulation. Instead of engaging sincerely and honestly with the actual arguments, the rational, coherent, academic, historical, best arguments of the position she wishes to discredit, Nguyen ignores them entirely and instead simply defeats a very poor argument offered by nearly nobody and claims smug victory overall. This is how a government destroys a free nation, with the lazy incuriousness of simpering, privileged elites. Well, that article is now live and published on the Good Source podcast and on the Good Source website. I hope you enjoyed it, found it helpful in articulating the kind of nonsense that authoritarian apologists like to offer. They don't ever tackle the best arguments, they always tackle the worst, and they have absolutely no sense of self-reflection whatsoever. And they speak with buckets and spades of irony and hypocrisy, only wanting the right to impose their vision of the world on everybody else and judging everybody else as morally inferior who disagrees with them. Let's go through some of your comments. Peter Manuel said, "I prefer to judge people by their actions, not what comes out of their mouth." Cecily says she's loving it. Thank you, Cecily. And adds, "Coercion is not choice." Exactly right. Toto Litar says, "Even the ABC knows, everybody knows, you bunch of corrupt politicians, TikTok, ALP and LNP, the Greens," and he's linked to a video. Thanks for that. Cecily again says, "I'm no anti-vaxxer. My children had all childhood vaccines, as did I." This is what I'm saying. This is no ordinary vaccine, and the hesitancy is based on the fear of the unknown. Adverse reactions that can be life-changing, and even death is no small reason to wait and observe. This is exactly right. If they've got nothing to fear, why do they censor and silence doctors and nurses who are testifying about immense loads of vaccine injuries being seen in hospitals? There's some great Telegram channels you can jump on and see where there's no censorship, and these doctors and nurses are speaking out. They have to hide their identity to protect their profession, and that's the point. They wouldn't have to hide their identity. They could be held accountable and scrutinized, and there could be a legitimate debate if they were allowed to talk. But the Australian regulators, the TGA and AHPRA, basically say, if you disagree with the official narrative about vaccines, you're barred from it. Why wouldn't people be afraid about something which is being covered up? You have every reason to be suspicious and cautious. What is beyond dispute is that there is no long-term safety data. There can't be, because there's no long-term. There's no experience here. It's perfectly legitimate to adopt a wait and see approach if you think your risk is extremely low. And it's not up to you to manage other people's risks by taking risks. That is just irrational, illogical, and barbaric. Christopher Williams says, "Hi, Chris. Just remember, many companies will refuse those who they employ, will sack any employee who refused to be vaccinated." Now, that's democratic, isn't it? Look, this is, I guess it is democratic if the majority of people want it. Democratic isn't an inherent good. It's not the kind of liberal democracy that we claim to have. It's not liberal, that's for sure. And democracy is meant to be synonymous with liberty. But the fact is, 2 lions and a goat voting on who to eat for dinner is democracy. Sometimes it can be quite tyrannical. And that's what we're seeing in the last 18 months. Democracy, the popular majority of people, are actually fully getting into this authoritarianism and very happy to have tyranny imposed on the people who don't do what the government says. We are, I don't know about a nation of convicts, but we have become a nation of jailers, that's for sure. SFA Sue, I'm sorry, is that a name? Fast Sue? Sorry, it's just not good for me. Dan 801 deaths, 801 deaths in quarantine. Yeah, quite hundreds. 819, I thought it might have been, but a lot, nearly 1,000 deaths in hotel quarantine. Linda Freeman, excellent. Al Morton, very well articulated, Dave. Thank you. Took a long time to write, and it's nearly 2,500 words, and I didn't even tackle all of the arguments in there. It's just an appalling display of logic, a complete absence of it. They're on the wrong side of history. That's an interesting argument. It's one that the left abuse and misuse all the time. They used it against defenders of marriage. You're on the wrong side of history. And it's a very indulgent way they used it as like a now point. Well, I actually know the end of history. I believe in Bible prophecy. And I'm sorry, but those people on the other side of the marriage debate to God are on the wrong side of history. And yet they used it against everybody else as if it was some weapon. I think the way we can use it honestly, and this might be what you mean, is that if we have a look at the lessons we learned from history and where we should be more mature now, then that would be the wrong side of history. If it's not a prophetic sense that you're using it, but a reflective sense, then that's then if it's a hindsight sense, then I think you're right. We've seen segregation of equal populations not work before. We've seen centralization and authoritarianism not work before. We've seen medical tyranny not work before. We've got the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and other international covenants, which very, very clearly were from the lessons of history and totally prohibit medical mandates, medical impositions like this. They are clear violations of human rights because of lessons we learned from history. So in that sense, you're absolutely right, Anna Martin. I hope that's how you meant it. God wins. Yep. Look, that's all the arguments, comments, and I appreciate your support and everything you've done here. You can follow me on Telegram, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. I wish Telegram was easy to use. I can just automatically post to everything else all at once. But sorry, trying to be more frequent on Telegram. You can follow me there. But if you would like to become a supporter, please head to davepello.com. Just trying to find a little banner where that has that. But anyway, that's right there, Dave Pello. Head to davepello.com to become a supporter. Your support's appreciated. It's not necessary. There are supporters helping me do this. I'd love you to continue to enjoy this for free. If you can't afford to support this work, or if you don't find value in it, please share it, please comment, please engage. It is provided free to you by the supporters of The Good Source and myself, Dave Pello, and that's super appreciated. Head to goodsource.news to sign up and join the newsletter. Your information will be kept private, and I'll send you updates infrequently, hopefully once a week at the most, and that'll be really good just to get some updates and insights there. Don't forget to share this article and this video, and thank you very much for watching. A couple of last comments. Anna says that's just what she meant, and Ray says the Sydney Morning Herald are very sick. Good work, everyone. Thank you so much, and we will see you next time. Bye-bye.